Imagine boarding a routine flight, expecting nothing more than the hum of engines and the soft glow of cabin lights. Now, picture this: an elderly black woman, poised in seat 1A, her silver hair pinned with grace, is suddenly confronted by a flight attendant who insists she doesn't belong there. Why would someone so calm be forced to prove her place at 30,000 feet? What does it take to stay silent in the face of injustice, and can quiet dignity truly topple prejudice? Evelyn Brooks isn't just any passenger. She's the wife of the airline's founder, a retired judge who has spent her life upholding justice. Yet her greatest victory isn't won in a courtroom. It happens here, where assumptions collide with authority, and one swift, shocking act of discrimination sparks a reckoning no one saw coming. As tensions mount and loyalties shift, every glance, every pause, every unheard word carries the weight of a lifetime of respect denied. Will a single moment redefine the power of silence? Are we ready to confront the biases we carry into the skies? If you're as determined to uncover the truth and witness courage under pressure as we are, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe now, because this is just the beginning. The airport was alive with sound. Wheels rolled across polished floors. Announcements echoed over the PA system in clipped tones. Laughter, frustration, the hush of boarding calls. It was the same chaotic melody every traveler knew. But through that noise, one figure moved quietly, deliberately, with a grace that didn't need to announce itself. Evelyn Brooks stood at gate 17A, her boarding pass tucked gently between two fingers. At 74, she had long mastered the art of stillness. There was nothing hurried in her posture, no trace of the anxious energy that buzzed through most passengers. She wore a pale gray cardigan over a navy blouse, a pair of crisp slacks, and comfortable flats. Her silver hair was swept neatly into a low bun. On her left hand, a gold wedding band caught the light as she adjusted the strap of her leather purse. She stepped forward when her group was called. The gate agent scanned her pass and smiled. "Welcome aboard. Mrs. Brooks, first class, right this way." Evelyn gave a warm but modest smile and nodded. "Thank you, young man." She made her way down the jet bridge slowly, thoughtfully, letting a mother and child pass ahead of her. The little girl turned and smiled at her. Evelyn smiled back, then continued forward. Inside the cabin, first-class passengers were already settling in. Some sipped drinks, others adjusted pillows. The overhead lights were dim and warm, casting a soft glow over the rows of leather seats. It smelled faintly of citrus-scented sanitizer and rich cabin materials. Evelyn walked to seat 1A, the very first on the left side of the plane, a window seat, her favorite. She gently set her carry-on beneath the seat in front of her and lowered herself with care. She pulled out a slim hardcover book from her tote and opened it to a bookmarked page. The story had barely begun to re-enter her mind when she sensed a presence. "Excuse me, ma'am." Evelyn looked up. A tall woman stood over her, dressed in a sharp blue uniform, her name tag gleaming beneath the cabin lights, Sierra Morgan. Her posture was practiced, chin raised just slightly, arms neatly behind her back, but her smile was strained at best. Evelyn met her eyes. "Yes, I just need to check your boarding pass." "Ma'am." Evelyn blinked once, then calmly handed it over without a word. Sierra looked at it, and then she looked again. The name matched the seat. Her brow furrowed slightly, but still, something flickered behind her eyes, doubt, perhaps, or something colder. She handed it back. "Thank you. Just making sure." Evelyn took the pass and nodded. "Of course." She returned her gaze to the book, but she could feel Sierra standing there for a moment longer than necessary. When the attendant finally walked away, Evelyn exhaled silently. She had felt that look before. It was never just about a seat. It never had been. A few rows behind her. Lena Harper watched the interaction. Young, newer to the job, Lena had a warmth that hadn't been ironed out of her yet. She tilted her head slightly, puzzled by Sierra's body language. Something about it made her stomach tighten. She made a mental note. As the last of the passengers boarded, Evelyn remained composed. She folded her hands on her lap and looked out the window, watching the rain begin to beat on the glass. The engines hummed softly, steady and familiar. She liked the sound. It reminded her of control, of reliability. She had traveled more than most. Court hearings, conferences, family funerals, even civil rights marches. She had been in courtrooms where every eye looked past her, and she had presided over cases where her voice changed lives. Still, the assumptions people made about her, especially here, on a plane, in first class, never seemed to disappear. She didn't bristle at it anymore. She just watched. Minutes passed. Then she heard it again. Heels clicking against the cabin floor, a clipboard, a sharp inhale. Sierra was back. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, "I'm sorry, but I need to ask you to change seats." Evelyn looked up slowly. "Change seats." "Yes, ma'am." Sierra's voice was tight. "There's been a mix-up with the manifest. This seat was assigned to a different passenger." Evelyn tilted her head. "My boarding pass says 1A. I confirmed it at the gate." Sierra pressed her lips into a thin line. "I understand. But sometimes a system auto-assigns a seat based on preferences. This one is typically reserved for certain passengers." She hesitated on the last words. Evelyn said nothing. She didn't need to. Sierra shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight of her own words. "I'm happy to reassign you just a few rows back premium economy. It's very nice." Evelyn's voice was quiet, measured. "I paid for this seat. I arrived early. I followed every rule. I would like to speak to the captain if there's truly an issue." Sierra blinked. Her jaw flexed. Then she straightened. "That won't be necessary. I'll handle it." She turned quickly and walked back toward the galley. Evelyn returned to her window, lips gently pressed together. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was disappointed, and that, to her, always cut deeper. Back near the beverage carts, Lena looked up as Sierra approached. "Is everything okay?" she asked carefully. Sierra didn't answer. Her shoulders were stiff. Lena glanced down the aisle toward 1A. Evelyn was still unbothered on the outside, but something about her presence, the poise, the calm, the clarity, it didn't match what Sierra was seeing. Lena's gut whispered, "This isn't over," and it wasn't. Because within the next 10 minutes, this flight would go from routine to unforgettable, and someone would lose everything. But not the woman in seat 1A. She had already won. All she had to do was wait. The hum of the engines had settled into a familiar rhythm, a quiet promise that the flight would soon be underway. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, securing bins and confirming latches. But for Evelyn Brooks, the flight had already taken a turn. She sat in 1A, her hands resting on the cover of her book. eyes watching the drizzle gather along the curve of the airplane window. Her posture hadn't changed. Neither had her breath. But inside her chest, something had shifted. It wasn't the request that bothered her. She had dealt with worse. No, what sat like a weight on her ribs was the way Sierra had looked at her. Not just like she didn't belong, but like she didn't deserve to question it. And Evelyn had learned long ago what that look could cost if left unchecked. Across the aisle in 1B, a businessman glanced over his glasses. He didn't say anything, but Evelyn noticed the slight turn of his head. People were paying attention now, even if they pretended not to. The thing about discomfort was that it made people act invisible. A few rows back, Lena Harper continued stocking cups and coffee packets. She kept glancing toward the front. She hadn't been in the job long, but she had been in life long enough to know what that kind of tension meant, and it bothered her more than she cared to admit. She watched Sierra return to the galley, her steps quick and tight, her hand gripping a tablet with unnecessary force. Sierra exhaled sharply. "She's refusing to move," she muttered under her breath. Lena hesitated. "Her ticket checks out, doesn't it?" Sierra didn't answer right away. She tapped on her tablet again. "That's not the point." Lena frowned. "Then, what is the point?" Sierra turned her head slightly, as if calculating how much she wanted to say. Then her voice dropped lower. "She doesn't look like someone who flies first class." Lena blinked. "I'm sorry," Sierra gave a tight shrug. "You've seen the type. It's not personal. It's about presentation, uniformity. First class sets the tone. You can't just have anyone sitting up front like they own the plane." Lena stared at her, unsure if she was more shocked by the words or by how casually they were spoken. Before she could respond, Sierra walked off again, her heels clipping like punctuation against the carpeted floor. Evelyn was still sitting in 1A, calm as ever, but this time she didn't look out the window. She watched Sierra approach. The flight attendant stopped just short of her seat and crossed her arms. "Mrs. Brooks, I'm going to ask you again. Please relocate to seat 14D. It's a window seat. Extra leg room." Evelyn looked up. Her voice was quiet, clear. Why Sierra's jaw clenched. As I explained earlier, there was a mistake in the system. The seat was meant for another passenger. My name is on the ticket. My seat is printed clearly. I verified at the gate. Yes, but sometimes we prioritize upgrades for our elite members. Platinum. Gold. Evelyn raised a brow. "Do I look like I care about metal cards?" Sierra blinked. "Ma'am, I'm trying to be professional. So am I." Sierra's voice sharpened. "This seat was not meant for you." There it was, not just implied, spoken, and it hung in the air like turbulence that hadn't yet struck. Passengers nearby stiffened. A woman in row 2 shifted in her seat, tugging her son's arm to keep him quiet. The man across from Evelyn stopped typing on his laptop. Evelyn didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted the sleeve of her cardigan. "I won't be moving." Sierra's face hardened. Her voice dipped into a whisper that still felt like a threat. "I can have security remove you." Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply said, "Then do it." Sierra hesitated. It was not the response she expected. From behind, Lena approached cautiously. "Is everything okay here?" she asked. Sierra turned sharply. "It's handled." Lena glanced at Evelyn, who offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "I'm just trying to read my book," Evelyn said gently. Lena looked back at Sierra. "Maybe we should—" I said it's handle. Sierra turned on her heel and walked to the front of the cabin. Evelyn sat quietly. Her hands never moved, but her thoughts raced. She wasn't new to this. She had been mistaken for the help in hotels she had owned shares in, ignored in meetings where her signature was on the wall, questioned in courthouses where she had worn the robe for decades. This was no different, and yet it always was, because even after a lifetime of it, the sting still found new places to settle. She looked at the blank page of her book and decided she didn't feel like reading anymore. At the front of the plane, Sierra stepped behind the curtain near the cockpit and grabbed the intercom. Her voice was tight, professional. "Captain, we have an issue in first class. Passengers refusing to comply with seat reassignment. I'd like clearance to alert ground security." There was a pause, then a low crackle of response. "What's the name on the ticket?" Sierra replied. "Evelyn Brooks." Silence. Another crackle. This time, a new voice, one that wasn't the captain. It was lower, calmer, more deliberate. "This is Thomas Brooks." Sierra froze. The intercom in her hand suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. "Would you like to repeat what you just said?" Sierra opened her mouth, but no sound came out. In the back galley, Lena's head snapped up. She knew that voice. Everyone who worked at Skybridge Airlines did. Thomas Brooks, founder, CEO, majority owner, the man who had built the airline from a charter line into an international force. And she had just tried to remove his wife from her seat. Lena moved instinctively toward the front. Evelyn sat in 1A, her face serene. She folded her hands, adjusted her scarf, and waited, because the flight hadn't even taken off, and already gravity had shifted. Sierra Morgan stood in the narrow passage near the cockpit, her hand still hovering near the intercom. The voice that had spoken deep, calm, and unmistakably authoritative echoed in her mind like a dropped stone in water. "This is Thomas Brooks." She felt the heat drain from her face. There were names you remembered in this business, names that carried weight even if you never met the person. Thomas Brooks wasn't just a name. He was the airline, the founder, the man who'd started Skybridge with a single twin-engine jet and turned it into a global carrier. People said he could ground entire departments with a phone call. Sierra had just tried to remove his wife from first class, and she had done it in front of passengers, loudly, publicly, and then she had laid hands on her. Her stomach flipped. She stepped back quickly, bumping into the beverage cart. The movement startled Lena Harper, who had just reached the galley from the rear. Lena looked up. What did he say? Sierra didn't answer. Was that really Thomas Brooks still? No answer. Sierra's throat was dry. She turned and walked briskly toward the rear of the plane, eyes wide, chest tight, heart pounding so fast she thought the passengers might hear it. In seat 1A, Evelyn Brooks sat unmoved. She stared out the window, her profile a study in calm. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't angry. She was simply present, and that made it worse. To the right of her, the man in 1B shifted uncomfortably. He didn't dare speak. The woman in 2A clutched her purse a little tighter. A teenager a few rows back stared openly, his phone in hand, pretending to text but clearly recording. Everyone on that plane knew now. They weren't flying on just any aircraft. They were flying on the aircraft that carried the wife of the man who ran it all. And someone had just slapped her. Lena approached Evelyn cautiously. "Mrs. Brooks," she said gently. Evelyn turned. Her expression was unreadable. I wanted to apologize. I didn't realize what was happening earlier." Evelyn studied her, not coldly, but with the patience of someone who had spent her entire life reading people faster than they could speak. "I know you didn't," she said. Lena nodded slowly. "Is there anything I can do?" Evelyn looked toward the curtain where Sierra had vanished. "Not unless you can take back time," she replied softly. Lena's face fell. She crouched down beside Evelyn's seat, lowering her voice. "She didn't know who you were." Evelyn didn't blink. That's the point. Behind her words was a quiet truth. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about status. It was about the assumption, the way Sierra had decided without asking, without caring that Evelyn didn't belong. Not in this seat, not in this class, not in this space, not in this world. Lena stood slowly, unsettled by the clarity in Evelyn's eyes. A soft ding interrupted the tension. The overhead sign lit up. Cabin secure. The plane was ready for departure. Except it wasn't. In the cockpit. Captain Daniel Rhodes sat in his chair, eyes fixed on the instruments. He wasn't touching them. He wasn't talking. He was thinking. He had heard Thomas Brooks over the comm line, and he had heard the tension in his voice. Rhodes wasn't a nervous man, but he knew the weight of what was unfolding. A senior flight attendant had physically assaulted a passenger who happened to be the wife of the man who signed his paychecks. He reached for the internal line. "Miss Morgan," he said, his voice steady but cool. "Please report to the cockpit." Silence. He waited. Another 10 seconds passed. Then footsteps approached the door. Sierra knocked once, opened the panel, and stepped inside. Her face was pale, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "Captain," she said quietly. Rhodes didn't look at her at first. He reached forward, switched on the intercom, and spoke calmly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be experiencing a short delay prior to takeoff due to a procedural matter. We appreciate your patience." He switched it off and turned to face her. "Do you understand what you've done?" Sierra opened her mouth, but no words came. Rhodes leaned forward slightly. "You put your hands on a passenger." "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "I was trying to de-escalate." "You escalated it," he snapped. "And it wasn't just any passenger." Her face twisted with dread. "I didn't know." "That's not a defense," Rhodes said sharply. He leaned back, pinching the bridge of his nose. A voice crackled over the cockpit radio. "Ground control. Captain Rhodes, Mr. Brooks is requesting to be patched in again." Rhodes didn't hesitate. "Patch him through." There was a pause. Then the voice returned. This time it was colder, even, almost formal. "This is Thomas Brooks. Has Miss Morgan been removed from passenger service?" Rhodes glanced at her. "She's here with me now." "Then let her know." Thomas said, "Effective immediately. She is relieved of all in-flight duties. She's not to interact with passengers again. Not a word, not a gesture, nothing." Sierra's knees almost buckled. "Additionally," Thomas continued, "she will be escorted upon landing to an administrative review office. Her contract is under termination review. Copy that." Rhodes said quietly. The line went silent. Rhodes stared at her. "I'm not asking if you understand," he said. "I do," Sierra murmured. "You'll remain in the crew jump seat in the rear cabin. I don't want another word from you today. Yes, Captain." She turned, but before she left, Rhodes added, "And if you try to speak to Mrs. Brooks again, I'll have you removed midair." Sierra froze, then walked out without another word. In the cabin, the curtain rustled. Sierra passed down the aisle slowly, her head low. Every passenger looked at her now, some with confusion, some with open contempt. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She could feel their judgment in every inch of skin. When she reached the back, she dropped into the jump seat and closed her eyes. But no silence could drown out the truth. She had just ruined everything, and the plane hadn't even left the ground. Evelyn Brooks had not moved. She still sat in 1A, her book closed now, resting in her lap. Her fingers touched the edge of the cover like it was a fragile thing, as if too much pressure might cause it to fall apart. Outside the window, the rain had slowed to a mist, and the lights along the tarmac glowed in soft halos. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. No one spoke. Not really. There were murmurs, a few glances traded between passengers, but no one addressed her. Evelyn could feel their eyes, the weight of them. They weren't watching out of concern. They were watching because they didn't know what else to do. It was always the same. People didn't look at her until it was safe to do so. She turned her face back toward the window and exhaled, a few rows behind her. Lena Harper stood by the beverage station, arms crossed over her chest. She didn't look away from the front. Sierra had disappeared into the back galley after exiting the cockpit. The captain's announcement had been vague, but everyone heard it. A short delay, a procedural matter, that was airline code for something big. Lena bit the inside of her cheek. Her eyes drifted to the passenger manifest. She had read the name earlier, Evelyn Brooks, and hadn't thought anything of it. Now she knew. Now the entire plane knew. And that changed everything. Or at least, it should have. She had been taught never to judge a passenger, but training manuals were neat and idealistic. Real life, with its frayed nerves and unspoken habits, wasn't so clean. She had seen the glances flight attendants gave when someone didn't look like they belonged in first class, the raised eyebrows, the accidental double-checking of tickets, the way kindness was rationed. Lena thought she was better than that. She still hoped she was. Back in the crew jump seat, Sierra Morgan sat stiffly, her knees close together, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her chest rose and fell too fast. She tried to breathe evenly, but the air felt thick. The captain's voice, firm and cutting, still rang in her ears. And worse, Thomas Brooks. She had only heard him speak once before, on a company-wide address streamed to staff. Even then, through a screen, he had presence. This time, he was talking directly about her, about what she had done. And the worst part wasn't just the shame, it was that she wasn't sure when she had crossed the line. It had all happened so fast. She had seen a woman in 1A, and something inside her had doubted. She hadn't said it aloud, not at first, but it had been there, the disbelief, the quiet resentment, the assumption, then the confrontation, the refusal, the challenge. She'd been so sure she was in the right. Now she wasn't sure of anything. A quiet voice broke through the silence. "I'm sorry." Sierra opened her eyes. Lena stood near the jump seat, holding a folded blanket in one arm. Her face wasn't smug or accusatory, just tired. Sierra didn't respond. Lena shifted on her feet. "I didn't want to say anything earlier. I didn't want to embarrass you, but that wasn't okay. Sierra looked down at her hands. I know. I don't think you do. That caught her attention. Sierra looked up. Excuse me, Lena spoke carefully. You didn't just question her seat, you treated her like a problem, and she hadn't even said a word. Sierra's face flushed. I didn't mean to. But you did, Lena said, and that's what matters. She paused. I've only been flying a year. You've done this longer than me. I look up to you. I watch the way you handle chaos. But today, what I saw, her voice trailed off. Sierra turned her face away. I made a mistake. Lena nodded. Yes, but this isn't about losing your job. Sierra looked at her, confused. Lena's voice dropped. This is about how easy it was for you to decide she didn't belong, and you don't even know why. The words settled between them like turbulence. Sharp, jarring. Lena didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked back toward the front. Sierra stared after her, and something inside her cracked. She didn't cry. She wouldn't. Not here. But her chest felt hollow. Near the front of the cabin, the passengers had begun to settle again. The tension hadn't gone away, but it had cooled slightly, shifting from active heat to quiet unease. A woman in row 2 leaned toward the aisle. Is she still sitting there? She whispered to her husband. He glanced forward and nodded. She hasn't moved an inch. They said nothing else, but Evelyn heard them. She always heard them. A young man in 3D adjusted his phone, clearly pretending to scroll through messages while recording. Another woman snapped a picture, then quickly turned away. Evelyn didn't flinch. She had lived long enough to know when people saw you as a person, and when they saw you as a moment. Lena approached with a cup of tea. Mrs. Brooks, she said softly, can I offer you something warm? Evelyn looked at her. The young woman's expression held something she hadn't seen earlier. Not pity, not fear, respect. Evelyn accepted the tea. Thank you. I'm truly sorry for what happened, Lena said, voice low. Evelyn gave a small nod. You didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do enough. Evelyn studied her, then gently replied, doing enough sometimes starts with knowing when to speak. Lena nodded slowly and stepped away. Evelyn sipped the tea. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely. Inside, the storm had just begun to settle, but she knew better. The real turbulence was still coming, and this time, it would not be in the sky. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft prepared for departure. Overhead, bins were closed, tray tables locked, passengers buckled in with half-hearted sighs. From the outside, everything appeared routine, just another flight heading east, but inside, the mood was far from normal. Evelyn Brooks remained in 1A, a pillar of stillness. The cup of tea Lena had brought her rested on the tray in front of her, barely touched. Her hands lay folded across her lap, her posture elegant, composed. She wasn't angry, she wasn't rattled, she was waiting. Across the cabin, glances continued to flicker toward her like whispers. People didn't say much, but their silence carried more meaning than they realized. The way they avoided her eyes, the way they shifted uncomfortably, trying to act like they hadn't seen. But they had. Everyone had, and the air had become thick with unspoken tension. In the rear of the plane, Sierra Morgan sat upright in the crew jump seat, her jaw tight, her mind spinning in too many directions. She couldn't stop hearing his voice. Thomas Brooks, that calm, deliberate tone that cut cleaner than any shouting could. "You are relieved of all in-flight duties. Effective immediately." Her heart still beat fast. Her fingers tapped against her thigh unconsciously, an old habit she picked up when nervous. She was trying to breathe through it, trying to make sense of what had happened. She wasn't used to feeling powerless, and worse than powerless, irrelevant. Sierra had always built herself around authority, around rules, around being the one in control, but now control had slipped out of her grasp in the span of a single conversation. And that woman, that passenger. She just sat there, said nothing, raised no voice, filed no complaint. One text, that's all it had taken. And now Sierra's entire career was balancing on a thread thinner than breath. She stood up suddenly. She couldn't sit any longer. Not like this. Not feeling useless. Not feeling watched from every direction. Lena noticed her movement immediately and stepped into her path. "You're not supposed to be up," Lena said calmly, but firmly. Sierra's mouth tightened. "I just need to know." Lena interrupted. The captain was very clear. Sierra looked past her, toward the front, toward Evelyn. "I need to fix this." Lena hesitated. Her voice softened, but her stance did not. "Fixing this doesn't start with more talking. You were told to stay put." Sierra didn't move. She didn't argue. She turned, stepped into the galley, and leaned heavily against the counter. Her breath shallow. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Rhodes listened to the final checklist from his co-pilot. Everything was green. Systems were ready, but departure was still on hold. The request from ground control was clear. Wait for authorization from corporate security. He knew what that meant. Mr. Brooks wasn't just reviewing the situation, he was preparing something, and it wouldn't be small. Rhodes didn't envy Sierra Morgan. He didn't like what she had done, but he also knew what it meant to fall from grace in this industry. It was never graceful. He looked over at the comm panel, still patched in with headquarters. Then he reached for the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said over the intercom, "we thank you for your patience. Our departure has been slightly delayed, but we expect clearance momentarily. Flight attendants, please continue cabin readiness." The words were neutral, but they landed heavy in the ears of every crew member, especially Sierra. She was no longer one of them. She wasn't preparing anyone. She was waiting, just like everyone else. Back in row 1, Evelyn finally shifted slightly in her seat, stretching her legs. The movement caught the attention of the man across the aisle, who lowered his magazine again. The woman in 2B leaned forward, then caught herself and pretended to adjust her purse instead. Evelyn noticed. She noticed all of it. People always looked right after they had already chosen to be silent. She didn't blame them, but she didn't excuse them either. She reached for her book again, not to read it, but simply to hold something, to anchor her hands. But just as her fingers brushed the leather cover, she heard the unmistakable footsteps, quick, heavy, clipped with frustration. She turned her head slightly. Sierra was walking down the aisle. Lena followed close behind, calling her name quietly, but Sierra wasn't listening. She stopped at 1A. All the cabin seemed to stop with her. Evelyn looked up. Sierra's eyes were tired. Her voice, when it came, was controlled but strained. "Mrs. Brooks, I need to speak with you." Evelyn said nothing. Her gaze didn't soften. "I understand I overstepped earlier. There was a misunderstanding about your seating assignment, and I let it escalate. That was unprofessional. Evelyn still didn't speak. Sierra's voice wavered. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to apologize directly." Then her tone changed slightly, quieter. "I didn't know who you were." Evelyn blinked. Her voice was soft, but piercing. "That's the problem." Sierra took a breath. "I know. I didn't mean before she could finish." Evelyn raised a hand. "Don't explain," she said. "Just own it." Sierra opened her mouth, then closed it again. "I wasn't looking for recognition," Evelyn continued, "but I do expect respect from anyone, regardless of what seat I'm in." Sierra nodded quickly. "Yes, of course." Evelyn's eyes didn't move from hers. "You assumed I didn't belong. You saw my face, my age, my silence, and decided I didn't fit here." Sierra's voice cracked. "I was wrong." "Yes," Evelyn said, "and being wrong has consequences." The words hung there. Then, behind them, a sharp gasp. It happened so fast. The plane jolted slightly as a tug moved the aircraft on the tarmac. Sierra lost her balance just a bit. Her hand reached out instinctively. It connected, sharp, open-palmed across Evelyn's shoulder and cheek. The sound cracked through the cabin like a slap against silence itself. It was over in a second, but the impact stayed. Passengers sat frozen. No one moved, no one spoke. Evelyn turned her face back toward Sierra slowly. Her cheek was red. Her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't even shocked. It was something far heavier. Disappointment. Sierra's hand hovered in the air like it didn't know what it had done. Lena reached forward instantly. "Sierra," she said, her voice urgent, "you need to back up now." Sierra took a step back, visibly trembling. Evelyn reached for her phone. She didn't yell, she didn't cry, she didn't even flinch. She simply typed something into the screen, her fingers steady, her face calm. Then she placed the phone gently on the tray and folded her hands again. The entire plane held its breath, because they all knew it was over. And whatever happened next, none of them were ready for it. The cabin was frozen. The kind of silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It wasn't the hush before takeoff or the respectful stillness during announcements. It was the silence that happens when the world realizes something irreversible has occurred. Evelyn Brooks sat motionless in 1A. Her cheek still bore the faint mark of Sierra Morgan's slap, a flush of red blooming across her skin. She didn't reach for it. She didn't react. Her hands rested calmly on the tray table, her fingers gently folded over her phone. Passengers sat paralyzed. Some glanced away quickly, pretending not to see what they had just witnessed. Others openly stared, lips parted, shock written across their faces. The man in 1B leaned away in his seat as if the very air next to Evelyn had become charged with consequence. No one spoke, not even Sierra. She had taken one stumbling step back, her mouth hanging open in horror. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, hands trembling by her sides as the reality of what she'd done crashed over her like a rogue wave. Lena Harper was the first to move. She darted forward from her position in the aisle, stepping protectively between Sierra and Evelyn. Her voice, though hushed, was firm and sharp. "Sierra, step back. Now." Sierra didn't argue. She couldn't. She took a step back, then another, until she was almost retreating. The cabin had become a stage, and she was at the center of a performance she hadn't rehearsed for. There was no script, no exit, just judgment, and it was everywhere. Evelyn finally moved, just her thumb. She unlocked her phone with a simple tap, opened her messaging app, and typed with practiced precision. No flourish, no urgency, just intent. One message. She pressed send. Then she placed the phone face down on her tray table and looked out the window, as if nothing had happened, as if the moment was already behind her. But it wasn't. In fact, it had just begun. Near the back of the aircraft, Sierra sat heavily in the crew jump seat, her face pale, her limbs stiff. Her body was frozen in the posture of someone who couldn't yet admit what had occurred. She didn't remember meaning to slap her. She hadn't thought, hadn't planned. It was instinct, some panicked reflex, a misplaced motion in the middle of emotion. But it didn't matter, because the result was the same. She had assaulted a passenger, and not just any passenger. Sierra swallowed hard. Her mind screamed with 100 scenarios. Could she explain it away? Say she tripped, claim it was an accident. But the cabin had gone quiet after the sound rang out. Phones were visible in people's hands. Eyes had widened. A gasp had moved like a ripple down the rows. Someone had seen. Someone had recorded. Someone always did. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The shame sat heavy on her chest, and deeper underneath that, fear. She tried to breathe slowly, but it felt like she was drowning. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Rhodes adjusted his headset and stared ahead at the control panel. His co-pilot sat beside him, silent but alert. A ping came through his headset from the internal system. He tapped the comm. "Go ahead," he said. "Captain," came a voice from operations. "Mr. Brooks is requesting an immediate update on the situation." Rhodes blinked. "Tell him the aircraft is secure, but there's been another incident." There was a pause on the line. Incident passenger was struck. Another pause, then a low intake of breath from the operator. "Please hold." A moment passed, then another, then a voice came on the line. This time, it was not the operator. "This is Thomas Brooks." Rhodes straightened immediately. "Yes, sir. She's okay. She hasn't spoken, but she appears calm." And the employee Rhodes exhaled. "Miss Morgan, she made contact. We believe it was in front of multiple passengers, possibly on video." Silence. Then came Thomas's voice again, this time quieter, colder. "She laid hands on my wife." Rhodes didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The weight of those words spoke for themselves. "I want her removed from duty. I want her employment suspended, effective immediately. And when that plane touches down, she is to be escorted by airport security to the administrative wing. No debriefing, no mediation. Do you understand me, Captain? Yes, sir? Good. And one more thing." Rhodes braced himself. "Tell Miss Morgan," Thomas said slowly, "to enjoy her last flight." The line clicked off. Rhodes sat motionless for a long second, staring out at the runway lights. He knew what that tone meant. There would be no second chances, no reassignment, no demotion, just an end. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had started to shift from stunned silence to quiet chaos. Whispers crept between seats. Did she really slap her? Was that the owner's wife? What's going to happen now? Someone murmured that security had already been alerted. Someone else mentioned corporate was monitoring the flight. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a version of the truth. But the one truth that no one dared to say aloud was that Sierra was finished, and Evelyn. She still hadn't said a word. She didn't have to. That was the most powerful part. She didn't scream, she didn't threaten, she didn't demand. She waited, and her silence said everything. Lena approached Evelyn's seat again, crouching gently to eye level. "Mrs. Brooks," she said softly, "is there anything I can do for you?" Evelyn turned her head slightly. "No, dear," she said, her voice calm. "You're doing enough." Lena hesitated. Should I call anyone? Evelyn's lips curved slightly. Not a smile, more like acknowledgement. "I already have." She looked at the phone on her tray. Lena followed her gaze. The screen was still dark, but the message had already been delivered. Not just to Thomas, to the entire plane. Every person who sat there in silence. Every person who watched instead of spoke. Every person who now realized what they had witnessed. It was done. And now, there was no going back. The flight still hadn't taken off. Outside the windows, the runway lights blinked patiently, casting slow, pulsing reflections across the wing. Inside, the tension had settled into something quieter but heavier, like fog that refused to lift. It was the kind of silence where thoughts got louder. In seat 1A, Evelyn Brooks had returned to stillness. Her phone rested on the tray, face down, like a closed book. She had not said another word since she pressed send. The flush on her cheek had faded slightly, leaving behind only the faintest trace. But what lingered wasn't pain. It was memory. Old memories. Moments she had tried to forget, but never could. Being told to use the back entrance of restaurants, being watched while shopping, being asked at hotel check-in if she was with the group when she was the keynote speaker, even when she had earned her law degree, even when she had been appointed to the bench. It hadn't stopped. And now, years later, with silver in her hair and wisdom in her bones, the disrespect had found her again, this time at 30,000 feet, before the plane had even left the ground. Evelyn adjusted the blanket over her lap, not out of cold, out of instinct, the kind passed down, generation to generation, that said, protect your dignity when others try to strip it from you. A few rows back, Lena Harper stood with her arms folded loosely, watching Evelyn from a distance. She couldn't shake what she'd seen. The slap, the silence that followed, the look in Evelyn's eyes not broken, not afraid, but deeply tired. Lena felt a pressure in her chest that she didn't quite know how to describe. It wasn't just guilt, it was a reckoning. She'd become a flight attendant because she loved people. She loved travel, conversation, the in-between moments. But today had reminded her that not everyone was treated equally in those spaces, not even close. She thought of her own grandmother, who raised her in a small town in Mississippi, a woman who had once been kicked off a city bus for asking the driver to announce her stop. Lena had always promised herself she'd stand up for people like her grandma. Today, she hadn't stood up fast enough, and she would carry that. Near the rear of the plane, Sierra Morgan sat motionless in the jump seat, her hands clenched together, knuckles white. Her eyes stared at the floor, unfocused. The burn of her own failure had started to spread. She replayed the slap over and over again, the sound of it echoing like thunder. It had happened too fast. Her hand had moved before her mind had caught up. And now it was the only thing anyone on the flight could remember. Sierra had worked 16 years in this airline. She had trained dozens of junior attendants, worked international routes, survived budget cuts and policy changes. She had weathered exhaustion, turbulence, emergencies, but 1 second had undone it all. And it wasn't just the action, it was what it revealed. She had never thought of herself as someone who discriminated, but now, as the weight of her choices settled, she saw it. She had questioned Evelyn not because of policy, but because of prejudice she didn't know she carried, and that was the hardest truth of all. At the front of the aircraft, Captain Daniel Rhodes opened the cockpit door and stepped into the cabin. He rarely did this before takeoff, but today was different. The plane remained still on the tarmac. Passengers whispered, waiting for a signal, a resolution. He walked slowly toward the first row. When he reached the seat 1A, he paused. Evelyn looked up. "Mrs. Brooks," he said quietly. She gave a small nod, acknowledging him. He lowered his voice. "I want to personally apologize for what happened. There is no excuse. We are conducting a full internal review. I understand if you wish to deplane or speak to authorities before we depart." Evelyn met his eyes. Her voice was calm, controlled. "Thank you, Captain. I'm not going anywhere." He nodded. "Very well. If there is anything you need, you have my full attention." Evelyn looked past him for a moment, toward the back of the aircraft. Then she said, "Make sure your staff understands who you fly, not just what you fly." Captain Rhodes stood quietly for a moment, then nodded again, this time slower. "I will." He turned and walked back toward the cockpit, each step carrying the weight of what he'd just heard. Back in her seat, Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, not to rest, to listen, because she could hear the shift in the plane's breath. The cabin had changed again. The balance of power had shifted not through threats or force, but through presence, through endurance, through grace. Behind her, a woman leaned toward her husband. She didn't even raise her voice. She whispered, "I know," he replied, and she didn't need to. Word had spread fast. One man near the window had already texted his brother. Another passenger had posted a tweet with no caption, just the photo of Evelyn sitting quietly and the words, "This woman just changed the flight." In the next 45 minutes, that tweet would go viral. But Evelyn wouldn't know that yet. She didn't need a spotlight. She had always lived in the quiet, and the quiet had always carried power. In the rear galley, Sierra sat slumped forward, head in her hands. She wanted to disappear. She had heard everything: the captain's apology, Evelyn's calm reply, the murmurs down the aisle, and worse, the absence of her own voice. There was nothing left to say. She had crossed a line in front of people, and now she would be held accountable in front of those same people. It wasn't just about losing a job. It was about losing the self-image she had clung to, the idea that she was fair, that she was decent. But fairness wasn't what you said about yourself. It was what others experienced from you. And today, Evelyn Brooks had experienced the worst version of her, and hadn't fought back, hadn't lashed out, had simply waited. Sierra closed her eyes and finally let herself feel it. Not the fear of losing her job, the shame of being seen as she truly was. The plane had finally begun to taxi. After nearly an hour of stillness, of delays and whispered questions, the aircraft rolled slowly onto the runway. The soft mechanical hum returned to the cabin, and with it, the familiar sense of surrender passengers feel when movement begins again, when control shifts from people to machine. Evelyn Brooks sat in 1A, her seatbelt fastened, her body still composed, but her mind very much alive. She could feel the change happening, not just on the plane, but in herself. Her phone buzzed once, a reply from Thomas. She turned it face up just long enough to read it. "I'm already at the airport. I'll be waiting when you land. We're handling everything. You just sit tight." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. She trusted her husband, not just with love, but with principle. They had both built their lives around the belief that justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a series of quiet, unshakable choices made by people who refused to be erased. And today, she had refused, not with protests or lawsuits, but by staying seated, in the seat she had paid for, the seat she had earned, the seat someone had tried to take from her. Lena Harper walked slowly down the aisle, checking passengers as the plane picked up speed. When she passed row 1, her eyes met Evelyn's for a brief moment. She didn't say anything, just gave a small, respectful nod. Evelyn nodded back. The plane lifted off. The ground fell away beneath them, but not all weight was lost. Some weight stayed with you, especially the kind that had nothing to do with gravity. In the rear galley, Sierra Morgan braced herself against the side panel as the aircraft leveled out. Her hands were cold. She hadn't moved from that spot since being ordered to sit down. She wasn't working. She wasn't needed. She was just there, a silent fixture on a flight she no longer belonged to. Her mind kept replaying the moment she struck Evelyn. Even now, hours later, she could still hear the sound, still feel the weight of what it meant. She hadn't just slapped a passenger. She had slapped dignity, slapped the idea that people like Evelyn belonged anywhere they chose to be, and Evelyn had done nothing to deserve it. She had been calm, composed, even gracious. That was the part Sierra couldn't escape. Evelyn's restraint had made Sierra's outburst look even uglier, even smaller. She thought of her own mother, a retired schoolteacher from North Carolina, who used to say, "If you have to yell to be right, maybe you're not." What would she think now? What would she say if she saw her daughter's name in the headlines because Sierra knew this wouldn't stay private? Not anymore. Too many phones, too many witnesses. The world had a way of showing up when it mattered most, and sometimes when it hurt the most. Up front, Evelyn closed her eyes and let her thoughts drift to her past, to her early years in Chicago, where she'd gone to law school against every warning and doubt, to her first day as a judge, when she'd walked into the courtroom and a white bailiff had mistaken her for the court reporter, to the years she had spent mentoring young black women who didn't know if they could lead because no one had told them they could. And now, here she was, in her 70s, still being asked to prove that she belonged. It never really stopped, but maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point wasn't to escape injustice. Maybe the point was to meet it again and again and never let it change who you are. Evelyn felt the vibration of another message. She glanced at the screen. News outlets already reaching out. Videos making rounds. You'll probably be recognized when you land. I'll meet you at the private terminal. She sighed quietly. Fame had never interested her. She had turned down awards, turned down interviews, but this story wasn't about her. It was about what the world did to people like her quietly, daily, invisibly, until someone saw, and once they saw, they couldn't unsee it. Captain Daniel Rhodes made a brief announcement over the intercom. "We've reached our cruising altitude. Flight time will be just under 3 hours. Smooth air ahead. We'll keep you posted. Thank you again for your patience." He didn't mention the incident. Didn't need to. Everyone still felt it. Every attendant, every passenger, every person who had seen something they couldn't explain away. Sierra stayed in the back, away from view. She didn't eat, didn't speak. Even Lena didn't try to reach her again. Some silence wasn't meant to be broken. Not yet. After the cabin lights dimmed for cruising, Evelyn took out her book once more, but this time, she didn't read it. She simply held it. Her thoughts drifted to her children, her grandkids. She wondered how they would feel when they saw the video. She knew they would be proud, but she also knew they'd be angry, hurt. She hoped they wouldn't let it turn into bitterness. That's what this world wanted sometimes, for people like her to grow tired enough to stop believing in decency. But she couldn't give in. She wouldn't. She had lived too long and fought too hard. So she let the book rest on her lap, her fingers tracing its spine like a memory. Somewhere in the cabin, someone snapped another photo. She could feel it, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't here for anyone's story but her own, and hers wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The cabin was dark now, cloaked in the soft hum of night mode. Overhead, lights were dimmed, windows shuttered, voices had quieted into occasional whispers. A few passengers slept beneath thin airline blankets. Their heads leaned against windows or each other. The atmosphere was subdued, but not peaceful. Not entirely. It was the kind of quiet that came after an argument too large to name. The aircraft cruised at 36,000 feet, but Evelyn Brooks was somewhere else entirely. She stared forward, not at the screen in front of her, not at the tray table, not at her book. Her eyes were open, but her thoughts had wandered miles behind. In her mind, she was back in a courtroom. A young black woman stood trembling before her, wrongfully accused, not because of her actions, but because of her presence. The evidence had crumbled under Evelyn's questioning. The case had collapsed, and when the woman left the courtroom, she had mouthed one word to Evelyn: "Thanks." Not "thank you, Your Honor." Not "God bless." Just "thanks." It was heavy, like a torch being passed in silence. Evelyn had carried it ever since. Now, as the cabin stretched in stillness around her, she wondered how many others had endured what she had today, this week, this lifetime, and kept going. How many had no husband to text, no courtroom history, no witnesses, no justice? She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years. Not because she didn't feel, but because she had learned how to absorb pain without breaking. That, too, had been taught by her grandmother, her mother, the women who came before her and knew what it meant to live in two worlds at once, seen and invisible. In the rear of the plane, Sierra Morgan still sat alone. She hadn't moved. The jump seat had started to dig into her back, but she didn't dare complain. Her thoughts had spiraled and slowed, landing, finally, in an uncomfortable truth she had never considered herself a villain. She was firm with passengers, yes, strict with rules, absolutely. But she had told herself it was for safety, for professionalism. She believed her job was to maintain order. Today, she had created chaos. The act itself, the slap, was unforgivable. But even worse was the assumption she'd made before it. The moment she'd decided that the woman in 1A didn't belong, that her silence meant guilt, that her skin, her age, her confidence, somehow it all added up to unworthy. That wasn't just bias, that was violence, the quiet kind, the kind that didn't bruise skin but bruised identity, and she had delivered it with precision. Lena hadn't spoken to her since. She hadn't even looked her way. That silence hurt more than anything else. Lena had once asked to shadow her on international flights, had once said, "You're the kind of attendant I want to be." That version of Sierra no longer existed, or maybe it never did. In the front of the cabin, Lena stood by the lavatory, hands clasped in front of her. She hadn't wanted to go to the back of the plane. She didn't want to see Sierra. Not yet. There was too much anger still buzzing under her skin, too much disappointment. She had looked up to her, learned from her, and now she couldn't even meet her eyes. But more than that, she couldn't stop thinking about Evelyn, how calm she had remained, how unshaken, and how that grace had exposed everyone else's discomfort. Lena hadn't known what real dignity looked like until today, and now she'd never forget it. A soft chime rang. Someone had pushed the call button from first class. Lena glanced down the aisle and saw the small light illuminated above seat 1A. She walked quickly and quietly. Evelyn turned as she arrived. "Just some water, please," she said gently. "Of course," Lena replied, and returned moments later with a chilled glass. As she handed it to her, Lena hesitated, then knelt slightly beside her seat, lowering her voice so no one else could hear. "I want to tell you something," she said. Evelyn tilted her head. "I used to think I knew what professionalism looked like, but today you redefined it for me." Evelyn gave her a small, sad smile. "I wasn't trying to teach anyone anything," she said. "I know," Lena whispered. "That's what made it real." They were quiet for a few seconds. Then Lena asked softly, "Are you okay?" Evelyn looked past her for a moment, toward the window, then back again. "I'm tired," she said, "but I'm okay." Lena nodded and stood. She wanted to say more, but she knew she couldn't fix it. Sometimes, the only thing you could offer was your presence. She returned to her post silently, her heart beating differently now. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Rhodes reviewed the flight log, his mind half-focused. He'd flown for 20 years. Storms, reroutes, even a fuel emergency once. But nothing had rattled him like this. He glanced at the intercom switch and paused, then pressed it. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said calmly, "we're expecting to arrive on time. Our descent will begin in approximately 1 hour. Thank you again for your patience." He released the switch, then sat in silence. He didn't say anything to his co-pilot, but both men understood. There were no standard procedures for what was happening, no checklist, no warning light, just people, raw and human, learning sometimes too late what it meant to carry weight that wasn't theirs. Evelyn sipped her water slowly. She looked down at her phone again. New notifications buzzed in, one after another. Mentions, tags, a message from her granddaughter, Grandma. "Is this really you in the video? I'm so proud of you." She sighed, smiling softly. She hadn't wanted to be a symbol, but maybe it wasn't about wanting. Maybe it was about answering when the world pointed a spotlight you didn't ask for. Not for fame, for truth, for legacy. The overhead lights slowly brightened as the pilot announced their descent. Seat backs were returned upright. Tray tables clicked into place. Window shades reopened to reveal streaks of golden evening light slanting across the sky. Far below, the city appeared as a quiet lattice of lights just beginning to flicker on. The descent had begun, but the heaviness inside the aircraft had never fully lifted. Evelyn Brooks took a long, slow breath. It wasn't nervousness. She'd flown often enough for the process to feel routine. But something about this descent felt symbolic, like returning to a world that now knew something it hadn't before takeoff. The message she had sent wasn't just about the woman who hit her. It was about the people who had watched, about the systems that allowed it to happen, about how dignity, when preserved, had the power to upend everything. She wasn't looking for revenge. She didn't need it. Justice, to her, had never been loud. It was patient, precise, unshakable. She pressed the window shade up a bit more and watched the clouds shift. The world below was waiting, and something told her it had already changed. Lena Harper moved down the aisle checking seat belts, speaking softly to passengers as she passed. Her voice had always been warm, but now it carried a kind of gravity she hadn't possessed before today. When she reached the front, she paused at 1A. Evelyn looked up. "Everything okay?" Lena asked. Evelyn nodded. "I'm ready. It wasn't just about landing. It was about facing what came next." Lena gave her a small smile and moved on, then turned toward the back to check the rear cabin. Sierra Morgan hadn't moved. She sat in the crew jump seat, staring straight ahead at the cabin wall. Her reflection in the galley mirror looked tired, hollowed out. There were no announcements left to make, no carts to roll, no distractions to bury herself in. All that remained was the knowing that when those doors opened, her life would change. There had been no further orders from the captain, no second calls from corporate, but she could feel it, in her gut, in the way no one had spoken to her since, in the way even the junior flight attendant, Lena, had passed her without a glance. It was over, and she had done it to herself. It wasn't just about a slap. It was about everything that led to it, the judgment, the entitlement, the quiet belief that someone else's presence needed to be explained, to be justified, even now. Sierra couldn't remember what she had thought Evelyn Brooks had done wrong. She only remembered assuming she didn't belong. That realization hurt more than the consequences, because it meant the problem wasn't just the mistake, it was the mindset, and mindsets didn't change overnight. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Rhodes checked the runway status, then flipped on the seatbelt sign. His voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our final descent into Atlanta. Please ensure all belongings are secured. Seat backs and tray tables are upright, and seat belts are fastened low and tied across your lap." He released the switch and leaned back in his seat. From this height, everything looked peaceful. But Daniel knew what waited below wasn't just ground, it was gravity in a different form. He had spoken with corporate twice during the flight. He knew what was coming. He had seen the passenger list, the witness names, the employee record being flagged in real time. There would be no negotiation, no HR review, no second chance. Miss Morgan's termination package had already been drafted. All they were waiting for now was wheels down. Back in 1A. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. The hum of the engine softened. The nose of the aircraft tilted slightly, and the city lights grew clearer. It was almost time. Passengers began to stir, bags tucked tighter under seats, children awoken gently by parents. The normal rituals of landing, so familiar and forgettable, but not today. Today would be remembered. For many, it would be retold over dinner, or typed into group chats, or posted with careful hashtags. For others, it would never be spoken aloud, but it would never be forgotten. Some things stay with you when you witness them in silence. The seatbelt light chimed one last time as the plane descended through its final layer of clouds. Then, at exactly 7:46 p.m., the wheels met the runway with a soft thud. There were no cheers, no polite applause, just the quiet sigh of deceleration. Evelyn opened her eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply exhaled like someone who had carried something heavy for too long and was finally about to set it down. As the plane rolled toward the gate, Lena stood beside the cockpit door, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She glanced back once toward Sierra. Still no movement, just breath, shallow and ragged. The parking brake hissed, and the aircraft came to a full stop. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Rhodes spoke again. "Welcome to Atlanta. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. We thank you for flying with us." The seatbelt sign dinged, and a few passengers stood almost too quickly. Then they froze. At the front of the cabin, a man in a tailored dark suit had stepped into the plane before the jet bridge even fully connected. He didn't wait for the passengers to begin deplaning. He walked straight to 1A. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was unmistakable. Thomas Brooks. He knelt slightly beside Evelyn's seat. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "I am now." He reached for her hand and held it for a moment. Not as a husband, not as the CEO of the airline, but as someone who understood the meaning of the moment. He stood and turned toward the aisle, eyes scanning the cabin once. Then he looked toward the back, where Sierra was still seated. His eyes didn't narrow. They didn't harden. They simply settled. Sierra looked away. She didn't need to be told. Two security officers in plain clothes boarded quietly behind Thomas and stood at the rear of the aircraft. Lena approached them and nodded slightly. One officer walked forward to speak with the captain. The other waited for the signal. Passengers began to disembark slowly, row by row. When they reached 1A, many paused. Some nodded at Evelyn. Some said thank you. One older man placed a hand over his heart and whispered, "For all of us." Evelyn gave him the smallest nod in return. The passengers continued filing out, and the world outside waited. The jet bridge connected with a soft clunk. The cabin door creaked open with a hiss. Fresh air poured into the aircraft, mixing with the silence that had coated every surface since takeoff. The first few passengers exited slowly, stepping into the terminal like they were leaving a sacred space, one where something had happened they couldn't quite explain, but would never forget. Some glanced back once more at Evelyn Brooks. She hadn't moved. She remained seated, upright, calm, hands gently folded in her lap. Thomas Brooks stood just behind her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder. He didn't speak. He knew his wife didn't need words right now. She needed space, time, respect. Lena Harper stood by the galley, guiding passengers out with quiet professionalism. Her voice was steady, her posture straight, but her eyes occasionally flicked back toward the rear of the plane, to Sierra, still seated, still staring forward. When the last passenger left, Thomas leaned down to Evelyn again. "You ready?" he asked softly. Evelyn nodded. Lena offered her a hand, but Evelyn rose without assistance. The strength in her movement surprised even Thomas, though it shouldn't have. She had been carrying the weight of a world's ignorance all her life. What was one more flight? They exited together, Evelyn first, Thomas behind her. As they stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, they were met not by noise, but by reverence. Waiting at the end was a line of staff, airport personnel, corporate representatives, security, and further back, standing quietly behind a velvet rope, was a growing group of reporters and curious bystanders, some with cameras, some with phones lifted, all silent. It wasn't chaos. It was observation. Evelyn paused for a moment, letting her eyes scan the faces. She saw a young black woman in an airline uniform standing near the back. Their eyes met. The woman didn't smile. She nodded. That was enough. Evelyn and Thomas were escorted through a side passage, bypassing the main terminal. The moment was over, but its echo had only begun. Back on the plane, Sierra Morgan sat in her jump seat, hands gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles were pale. The two plainclothes security officers stood nearby. One of them, a black man in his 40s, finally spoke. "You'll come with us now." Sierra didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't plead. She simply stood, straightened her jacket, and walked down the aisle she had once owned with confidence. It felt different now. Smaller, colder. Lena didn't speak as she passed. She didn't need to. Sierra kept her head down at the galley door. She paused and turned back once, looking at the now empty cabin. Then she stepped off. She was escorted down the secondary ramp toward the administration wing, not handcuffed, not shamed publicly, but with a finality she couldn't escape. In the captain's log, Daniel Rhodes made careful notations. Incident reported to HQ in flight. Security request confirmed. Employee removed per corporate directive. But beneath those clinical words, he knew what the day had truly been about. Not procedure, not policy, but people. The failure and the power of people. And he had witnessed both, outside the airport. Evelyn and Thomas entered a waiting black sedan that had been parked in the executive zone. Inside, Thomas gave a quiet nod to the driver, who pulled away without a word. Neither of them spoke at first. Only the city moved past the windows. After a few minutes, Evelyn finally exhaled. "I didn't think it would go that far," she said. Thomas looked at her. "You did nothing wrong." "I know," she said. "That's not what I mean." He waited. She looked out the window, watching a traffic light change. "I've spent my whole life holding things in, carrying them, trying not to be the angry black woman, trying not to be the problem, trying to rise above every time someone looked at me like I didn't belong." She paused, and today I sat down and said nothing, and somehow that's what made the world look. Thomas reached across the seat and took her hand. "They didn't see your silence," he said. "They saw your strength." She didn't reply, but she squeezed his hand back. At that moment, her phone vibrated again. She glanced at the screen. Hundreds of new messages, articles, mentions. A journalist had written, "A silent stand by an elderly black woman has shaken the airline industry." Another post read, "Grace under pressure, dignity under fire." Evelyn Brooks didn't just sit in 1A, she sat in history. Evelyn shook her head. "I didn't want this," she murmured. "You didn't seek it," Thomas corrected. "But sometimes the truth needs a face, and today it chose yours." The car turned down a quieter road toward a private residence. Thomas looked out the window and added, "They'll fire her, you know." Evelyn nodded. "They have to, but that won't fix the deeper problem." "No," she said, "it won't." He turned to her. "So what now?" Evelyn stared straight ahead. "I speak," she said. "I've been quiet long enough." A week had passed. The video had been shared more than 8 million times. The hashtags trended, opinion columns were written, news anchors led with it. Evelyn Brooks had become, against her will, a symbol, but she had also become something else, a reminder. She sat now in the sunlit library of her home, just outside Atlanta. Tall windows framed the warm afternoon. A light breeze stirred the curtains. On the coffee table were two stacks, one with handwritten letters, one with printed emails. Both continued to grow, from strangers, from flight attendants, from judges, from students, from people who had seen her sit quietly, dignified, in a seat meant to be hers and realized that they, too, had once been made to feel like they didn't belong. Evelyn picked up a letter and read slowly. My mother cried watching what happened to you. She's 81 and has stories I've never heard until now. She said she's proud of you like you were her daughter. She set it down gently and reached for her tea. On the mantel behind her, a framed photo sat of Evelyn in her judicial robe, her hand resting on a law book, her gaze calm and strong. Next to it was a recent printout from an airline press release, effective immediately. Sierra Morgan is no longer employed with our airline. While this action was necessary, we recognize that true accountability must be followed by meaningful change. We are launching a mandatory bias and conduct training for all flight and ground crew personnel. A step, small, late, but a step. The door creaked open behind her. Thomas entered quietly, carrying a small box. You got another one, he said, setting it down with a smile. What is it now? She asked without looking up. More mail. Looks like a school sent this one. She raised an eyebrow. 5th grade class in Oakland. They wrote essays about what courage means after watching the video. Evelyn let out a soft laugh. Courage, she repeated. Funny how often people confuse it with noise. Thomas sat beside her, and forget how powerful silence can be. For a few moments, they simply sat, no news alerts, no phones, just sunlight and tea and peace. Then Evelyn broke the silence. Do you think she'll land on her feet? Thomas didn't ask who she meant. I don't know, he said honestly. I don't want her life destroyed, Evelyn said. I want her changed. That's not up to you, he said gently. No, she nodded. But I hope she chooses better next time, far across the city, in a small apartment near the airport. Sierra Morgan sat at her kitchen table, the letter of termination still in her hand. She had read it 10 times. Each word landed heavier than the last. There was no hearing, no appeals process, no severance, just an end. The email also included a corporate note offering a list of recommended counseling services. She hadn't called any of them yet. Sierra looked out the window at the planes taking off. She used to know the flight numbers by sound alone. Now, they all sounded the same. She thought about Evelyn, how calm she had been, how powerful in her stillness. Sierra had lost her temper, but Evelyn had never lost herself. She opened her laptop and typed slowly into the search bar, how to unlearn bias. Then she paused, deleted it, typed again, how to apologize when you finally understand. The screen stayed still for a long moment before results populated. She clicked the first one. She was starting from the beginning. At the Brooks residence, Evelyn stood slowly and walked to the window, stretching gently. She felt the stiffness in her joints, but also something looser in her chest, something that had settled. Her phone buzzed, a message from Lena Harper. Hi, Mrs. Brooks. I hope this isn't inappropriate. I just wanted to say thank you. I watched you that day and realized how far I still have to go, not just as a flight attendant, but as a person. I'm learning because of you. Evelyn typed back, thank you. Lena. That's all any of us can do. keep learning, keep choosing better. A moment later, another buzz, this one from a blocked number, just a single sentence. I'm sorry for everything. No name. But she didn't need one. She smiled softly. Progress didn't always arrive with banners. Sometimes it arrived in whispers. The doorbell rang. Thomas opened it to find a deliveryman holding a white box. He handed it over with a nod. Special delivery for Mrs. Brooks from headquarters. Thomas raised an eyebrow and brought it inside. Evelyn opened the box carefully. Inside was a small envelope and a plaque. The envelope held a handwritten card from the airline's CEO, not her husband, but the newly appointed acting executive officer. Mrs. Brooks, it read. What happened aboard that flight was unacceptable. But what followed reminded us why your presence on our aircraft was more than a ticketed seat. It was a gift of truth. As a symbol of our gratitude and acknowledgement, we'd like to name Seat 1A across our new fleet the Evelyn Brooks Honor Seat. May it always remind us that dignity does not ask for permission. It simply arrives. Evelyn set the letter down, silent. Thomas reached for the plaque and read the inscription aloud, reserved for quiet courage. She didn't speak, not for a long while. Finally, she looked at him and said, It's not about the seat. He nodded. I know. It's about the fact they know now, that silence can be resistance, that grace is not weakness. He folded his arms, and that when black women choose to sit, the world should pay attention. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, tea cooling beside her. She wasn't interested in speeches or interviews. She didn't need a spotlight. Her seat had spoken for her, and now, maybe it would speak for others too. Outside, a plane soared overhead, slicing through the sky with quiet force. You've just witnessed more than a flight gone awry. You've seen how respect can be reclaimed, how a single act of quiet resistance shines a spotlight on systemic bias, and how one woman's unwavering dignity can inspire a movement. Let's carry that courage off the plane and into our daily lives, challenging injustice wherever we find it, and honoring every person's right to belong. If Evelyn's strength moved you, show some love by liking and sharing this video, and make sure to subscribe so you won't miss our next story, because together we can keep the conversation alive and continue to stand up for what's right. See you on the next flight.